Imagine a prison where inmates don't live in cells. They live in houses with their families, where they run restaurants, bars, beauty salons, where they buy and sell real estate, where cartel bosses order executions from luxury condos while their families sleep 2 floors up. That prison existed for decades in the middle of Tijuana, Mexico, 20 minutes from the U.S. border. La Mesa State Penitentiary was known as El Pueblito, the little town, a lawless, self-governed village within the walls of a prison where prisoners lived with their families, ran businesses, and even enjoyed luxuries like restaurants, boxing matches, and music concerts. History Cup. Built to hold 600 inmates, by the 1990s and 2000s, it held over 7,000. History Cup. Built to hold 3,000, La Mesa became the most overcrowded prison in Mexico, crammed with 8,000 prisoners, sometimes housed 24 to a 10 by 13 cell. State of Michigan. Then, in 2002, 1,500 federal police and soldiers stormed the prison in a surprise nighttime raid. High-level cartel prisoners were transferred to maximum security facilities, and over 900 makeshift houses and businesses were demolished. History Cup. What happened next was worse. In September 2008, a day-long riot left 19 inmates dead and nearly 60 wounded. ABC 13 Houston. Prisoners report being chased down prison hallways by police, shooting at them from behind, and federal military police firing live ammunition at prisoners from helicopters. State of Michigan. So before you hear another word, answer me this. If a government allows a prison to become a cartel-controlled city for decades, then violently destroys it, then loses control again in riots that killed dozens, who failed? The inmates who built the city? The guards who let them? Or the system that created the conditions for both? Drop your answer in the comments right now. Subscribe, because this channel doesn't do stories about prisons that work. We show you what happens when the state abandons its most basic responsibility and criminals fill the vacuum. This is La Mesa, the prison that became a town, the town that became a battlefield. It starts now.
Tijuana, Mexico. The border city, the prison, and the world within the walls. Before the raid, before the riot, before the bodies piled up in the hallways and the helicopters fired live ammunition into the courtyard, you have to understand where La Mesa existed. Not just geographically, though that matters, structurally, economically, culturally. Because La Mesa State Penitentiary was not simply a prison that failed to control its inmates. It was a prison that, for decades, deliberately ceded control to them. And what the inmates built in that vacuum was not chaos, it was order, their order. A parallel society with its own economy, its own hierarchy, its own rules. A city within a prison that functioned more like a neighborhood than an institution. And when the Mexican government finally decided to destroy that city, the violence that followed was not the breakdown of order. It was the collision of two incompatible systems, both claiming authority over the same space. Tijuana is the largest city in Baja California, Mexico, located directly on the U.S.-Mexico border, separated from San Diego, California, by a fence and approximately 20 minutes of driving. The city has a population of over 1.8 million people. It is also one of the busiest border crossings in the world. It is also one of the most dangerous cities in Mexico, a violence driven by drug cartels competing for control of smuggling routes into the United States. The Tijuana cartel, the Sinaloa cartel, and smaller criminal organizations have fought for decades over territory, leaving thousands dead. The violence is not hidden. It is public, routine, and often involves law enforcement and government officials who are either corrupted or killed. In this environment, institutions do not function the way they are supposed to. Police are paid by cartels, judges are threatened, politicians are assassinated, and prisons, which in theory should be the most secure institutions the state controls, become extensions of the criminal networks they are supposed to contain. La Mesa State Penitentiary was constructed in 1957 on the outskirts of Tijuana, approximately 5 miles from the U.S. border. The facility was designed to hold 600 inmates. It was a state-run penitentiary operated by the government of Baja California, responsible for holding individuals convicted of state-level crimes and individuals awaiting trial in the state court system. The architecture was standard for mid-20th century Mexican prisons: concrete cell blocks arranged around a central courtyard, high walls topped with guard towers, a single main entrance controlled by administrative staff. The design assumed that inmates would be housed in cells, that movement would be controlled, that guards would maintain security. That assumption lasted less than a decade. By the 1970s, La Mesa was already overcrowded. Built to hold 600 inmates, by the 1990s and 2000s, it held over 7,000. Some sources report even higher numbers. Built to hold 3,000, La Mesa became the most overcrowded prison in Mexico, crammed with 8,000 prisoners, sometimes housed 24 to a 10 by 13 cell. The discrepancy in design capacity reflects different assessments over time, but the core reality is consistent. The facility was holding between 5 and 10 times the number of people it was designed for. The infrastructure could not support that population. There were not enough cells, not enough beds, not enough toilets, not enough guards, not enough food. The state could not provide the basic resources required to operate a prison at that scale, and so, gradually, control shifted from the guards to the inmates. What emerged was something unprecedented in Mexican corrections history. La Mesa State Penitentiary was known as El Pueblito, the little town, a lawless, self-governed village within the walls of a prison where prisoners lived with their families, ran businesses, and even enjoyed luxuries like restaurants, boxing matches, and music concerts. Inmates were not confined to cells. They built houses, actual residential structures made of concrete block and corrugated metal with multiple rooms, running water, electricity. They built commercial establishments, restaurants serving tacos and seafood, bars selling beer and liquor, beauty salons, barber shops, mechanics garages, small grocery stores. They built infrastructure, paved streets between the houses, drainage systems, lighting. The prison became a neighborhood. Inmates lived with their wives and children. Families moved into the prison not as visitors but as residents. Children were born inside La Mesa. They grew up there, attending makeshift schools run by inmates, playing in courtyards that doubled as soccer fields. The economy inside La Mesa was robust and complex. Inmates with money, usually cartel members with access to outside funds, purchased the best housing. Real estate transactions occurred regularly. A well-constructed house near the center of the prison, with running water and electricity, could sell for thousands of dollars. Inmates without money rented space, sometimes sleeping in shifts in communal areas. The restaurants and bars were profitable businesses. Guards and prison staff were customers. Visitors from outside, family members coming to see inmates, would eat at the prison restaurants, drink at the prison bars, get haircuts at the prison salons. The prison economy generated revenue.
Some of it went to the inmates who owned the businesses, some of it went to the guards who facilitated the operations, and some of it went to the cartel bosses who controlled the prison and taxed every transaction. The hierarchy inside La Mesa was explicit and enforced by violence. Cartel leaders occupied the best housing, multi-story structures with private bathrooms, air conditioning, satellite television. They held court in their homes, meeting with lieutenants, ordering operations outside the prison, managing drug trafficking networks that extended across Mexico and into the United States. The most powerful inmates were effectively untouchable. Guards did not enter their areas without permission. Raids were rare, and when they occurred, they were usually negotiated in advance to avoid bloodshed. The cartel bosses maintained order inside the prison through a combination of patronage and fear. They provided services to other inmates, jobs, housing, protection. In exchange, they demanded loyalty and a percentage of all economic activity. Inmates who challenged the hierarchy were beaten, stabbed, or killed. Bodies were disposed of quietly. The guards knew, the administration knew, and for decades everyone accepted this arrangement because it worked. The prison was overcrowded but relatively stable. Violence occurred but was contained. The state did not have to manage the facility because the inmates were managing it themselves. The families living inside La Mesa were part of this system. Wives and children of inmates moved into the prison because housing outside was expensive and dangerous, and because the prison, paradoxically, felt safer than the streets of Tijuana. Inside La Mesa, families were under the protection of the inmate hierarchy. Outside, they were vulnerable to rival cartels, to police extortion, to the general violence that characterized Tijuana in the 1990s and 2000s. Children attended school inside the prison. They played with other children whose fathers were also incarcerated. They grew up in an environment where the boundaries between freedom and incarceration were blurred. To them, the prison was not a punishment, it was home. The physical layout of La Mesa by the late 1990s bore no resemblance to its original design. The cell blocks still existed, but were primarily used for newer inmates who had not yet secured housing. The central courtyard, which had been designed as an exercise area, was now a dense residential neighborhood with narrow streets winding between houses, laundry hanging from lines, children running between buildings. The guard towers were still manned, but the guards did not patrol the interior. They controlled the perimeter and the main gate. Everything inside the walls was controlled by the inmates. Visitors entering La Mesa described it as surreal, walking through a gate guarded by state employees and then entering a community that operated entirely outside state control. You could buy a meal, you could get a haircut, you could attend a boxing match, you could hire a prostitute, you could purchase drugs. All of this happening inside a facility that, in theory, was operated by the government of Baja California. The situation at La Mesa was not secret. Journalists visited and wrote about it. Human rights organizations documented it. The federal government knew. The state government knew. And for decades, no one intervened. The reason was pragmatic. Intervention would be violent, expensive, and politically risky. The inmates at La Mesa included members of the Tijuana cartel, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Mexico. Any attempt to assert control over the prison would be met with resistance. Inmates would fight, guards would be killed, and the federal government already.
To understand how a prison holding over 7,000 inmates in a space designed for 600 became a self-governed city controlled by cartel bosses, you have to understand the system that allowed it. Not just La Mesa, though that matters. The entire structure of Mexican corrections, the legal framework, the political economy, the corruption that is not individual moral failure, but institutional design. Because La Mesa was not an anomaly. It was the logical endpoint of a prison system that had been underfunded, understaffed, and penetrated by organized crime for decades.
and the conditions that produced El Pueblito, the little town inside the prison, were conditions that existed across Mexico. The Mexican prison system in the 1990s and 2000s operated under a legal framework that divided responsibility between federal and state governments. Federal prisons, operated by the Secretariat of Public Security, held individuals convicted of federal crimes, drug trafficking, organized crime, weapons violations. State prisons, operated by individual state governments, held individuals convicted of state-level crimes and individuals awaiting trial in state courts. This division created a two-tiered system. Federal prisons received more funding, had better infrastructure, and were subject to more oversight. State prisons received less funding, operated with minimal oversight, and were far more vulnerable to corruption. La Mesa was a state prison, which meant it was under-resourced, understaffed, and left to manage itself with almost no external support. The funding model for state prisons in Mexico was and remains inadequate. State governments allocate budgets for corrections based on projected inmate populations, but those projections are almost always lower than actual populations. The result is chronic underfunding. Guards are paid poorly, often less than $500 USD per month. Food budgets are insufficient to provide adequate nutrition. Medical care is minimal. Infrastructure maintenance is deferred. And when resources are scarce, corruption becomes a survival strategy. Guards supplement their income by facilitating the entry of contraband. Administrators accept bribes in exchange for housing assignments, visitation privileges, and transfers. Inmates with money can buy almost anything. Inmates without money endure the worst conditions the system has to offer. At La Mesa, the corruption was not hidden. It was systemic and openly acknowledged. Prisoners lived with their families, ran businesses, and even enjoyed luxuries like restaurants, boxing matches, and music concerts. None of this could have happened without the cooperation of guards and administrators. The construction of houses inside the prison required building materials. Those materials had to be brought in through the main gate. Guards facilitated that entry. The operation of restaurants and bars required supplies, food, alcohol, equipment. Those supplies came through the gate. Guards allowed it. Families living inside the prison required approval from the administration. That approval was granted. In exchange, guards and administrators received payments. Some of those payments were direct bribes. Some were indirect. Guards ate for free at inmate-run restaurants, received free haircuts, were given gifts. The system was mutually beneficial. Guards earned more than their salaries. Inmates got to live in better conditions, and the administration avoided the violence that would have resulted from attempting to enforce traditional prison rules. The legal framework governing Mexican prisons theoretically prohibited all of this. The Mexican Constitution guarantees the right to humane treatment for prisoners. The federal law of execution of penalties establishes standards for detention conditions. International agreements, including the United Nations Standard Minimal Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, apply to Mexico as a signatory. On paper, inmates at La Mesa had rights. In practice, those rights meant nothing, because the enforcement mechanisms did not exist. State human rights commissions visited the prison periodically and documented the conditions. They issued reports, they made recommendations, and nothing changed, because the state government of Baja California did not have the resources, the political will, or the capacity to implement reforms. The federal government, which had more resources, did not have jurisdiction over state prisons unless invited to intervene, and the state government, which did have jurisdiction, benefited from the status quo. As long as La Mesa remained relatively stable, as long as inmates were not escaping, as long as the violence stayed inside the walls, the state government had no incentive to disrupt the arrangement. The economy inside La Mesa was more than just restaurants and bars. It was a comprehensive black market that replicated almost every service available in the outside world. Drugs were available: marijuana, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamines. Weapons were available: knives, guns, even grenades. Prostitution was available. Cell phones were ubiquitous, allowing inmates to communicate with criminal networks outside the prison. The cartel bosses inside La Mesa were not cut off from their organizations. They were running them. Orders for drug shipments, assassinations, kidnappings, and extortion were given inside the prison. The prison was not interrupting their criminal operations, it was hosting them. The cartel hierarchy inside La Mesa mirrored the structure of the cartels outside. The Tijuana cartel, also known as the Arellano Felix organization, was the dominant power inside the prison during the 1990s. High-ranking members of the cartel occupied the best housing and controlled the most profitable businesses. They employed other inmates as security, as couriers, as enforcers. They maintained discipline through violence. Inmates who stole, who informed to guards, who challenged the hierarchy, were beaten or killed. The bodies were usually disposed of quietly, buried in unmarked graves inside the prison, or smuggled out through the same channels that brought in contraband. The official death toll at La Mesa was low. The actual death toll was almost certainly much higher. The federal government knew all of this. Intelligence reports documented the presence of cartel leaders at La Mesa. Wiretaps captured phone calls between inmates and their associates outside. Federal law enforcement agencies had enough evidence to prosecute, but lacked the political support. Because intervention would require a large-scale raid, and raids were dangerous. Guards would resist because they were complicit. Inmates would resist because they had weapons and nothing to lose. Families would be caught in the crossfire. And the political cost of a botched raid, dead guards, dead inmates, dead children, was higher than the cost of tolerating the status quo. But by 2002, the political cost of inaction had risen. President Vicente Fox made criminal justice reform a priority, and the federal government began asserting control over state prisons that had become cartel strongholds. La Mesa was targeted not because it was the most violent prison in Mexico, but because it was the most visible symbol of state failure. Journalists had filmed inside the prison. Documentaries had been made. The international community was aware that a Mexican prison had become a cartel-controlled city. The embarrassment was political, and the solution was force. On September 17, 2002, 1,500 federal police and soldiers stormed the prison in a surprise nighttime raid. The operation was massive. Federal police, military personnel, and intelligence agents surrounded the facility. Helicopters provided aerial support. The raid began at 3 a.m. Inmates were asleep. Families were inside. The federal forces entered through the main gate and through breaches made in the perimeter walls. They met resistance. Inmates fired weapons. Some guards, loyal to the cartel bosses, also fired. The fighting lasted several hours. By dawn, the federal forces had secured the facility. High-level cartel prisoners were transferred to maximum security facilities, and over 900 makeshift houses and businesses were demolished. The demolition was systematic. Bulldozers entered the prison and began tearing down the structures that inmates had built over decades. Houses were destroyed. Restaurants were demolished. The infrastructure of El Pueblito was erased. The families living inside the prison were expelled. Children who had grown up inside La Mesa were forced to leave. The prison was returned to its original design: cell blocks, a central courtyard, guard towers. The federal government declared the operation a success. They had reasserted state control. They had dismantled a cartel stronghold. They had restored order. But the system that produced La Mesa had not been dismantled. The overcrowding remained. The underfunding remained. The corruption remained. And within months, the violence that had been suppressed by the cartel hierarchy began to resurface, because the cartel bosses had maintained order through patronage and fear. The federal government maintained order through force alone, and force without resources, without reform, without addressing.
They were not monsters. They were people operating within a system so broken that building a city inside a prison seemed rational. The cartel bosses who controlled La Mesa were criminals, murderers, traffickers, extortionists. But they were also administrators who provided housing, jobs, and protection to thousands of inmates who would have had none of those things otherwise. The families living inside the prison were not complicit in crime. They were poor, desperate, and trying to survive in a country where the streets were more dangerous than the prison. The guards were not all corrupt. Many were workers trying to support their families on salaries so low that accepting bribes was the only way to make ends meet. And the government officials who allowed La Mesa to become El Pueblito were not all indifferent. Some tried to reform the system. They were ignored, transferred, or threatened. The people at the center of La Mesa were not uniformly evil or uniformly good. They were caught in a system that rewarded corruption and punished reform. And when that system finally collapsed, most of them paid the price. The most powerful figure at La Mesa during the 1990s was not a guard or an administrator. It was an inmate. Specifically, it was whoever controlled the Tijuana cartel's operations inside the prison at any given time. The Tijuana cartel, led by the Arellano Felix brothers, was one of the most violent and profitable drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. Several high-ranking members of the cartel were incarcerated at La Mesa during the 1990s and early 2000s. These men did not live like prisoners. They lived like executives in exile. They occupied multi-story houses with private bathrooms, air conditioning, kitchens, and entertainment systems. They held meetings in their homes. They received visitors, family, lawyers, associates from outside. They continued to run cartel operations through cell phones and through couriers who moved in and out of the prison. And they maintained control over the prison population through a combination of patronage and violence. One of the most notorious inmates at La Mesa was Ishmael Higuera Guerrero, known as El Mayel, a high-ranking lieutenant in the Tijuana cartel. Higuera was responsible for overseeing the cartel's operations in Tijuana and for coordinating drug shipments into the United States. He was arrested in 2000 and sent to La Mesa. Inside the prison, he continued his work. He lived in a house with his wife and children. He ran businesses. He ordered murders. He was, in every practical sense, free. His incarceration was administrative, not functional. The bars and walls that were supposed to contain him contained his body, but not his power. The families living inside La Mesa were a cross-section of Mexican society's most vulnerable populations. Most were wives and children of inmates. Some were extended family members, mothers, siblings, cousins. They moved into the prison because they could not afford housing outside, because they needed the protection that the cartel hierarchy provided, or because they simply wanted to be close to their incarcerated relatives. Children born inside La Mesa grew up in an environment that normalized incarceration. They attended makeshift schools taught by inmates. They played in courtyards surrounded by armed men. They witnessed violence. They learned that the world inside the prison was the only world they could rely on. Some of these children would later be arrested themselves, continuing a cycle of incarceration that began before they were born. One woman, whose name was not disclosed in media reports, but whose story was documented by human rights organizations, lived inside La Mesa for 5 years with her 3 children. Her husband was serving a 20-year sentence for drug trafficking. She could not afford rent outside the prison. She could not find work that would support her family, so she moved into the prison. She rented space in a structure built by another inmate.
She cooked meals in a communal kitchen. She washed laundry in communal sinks. She sent her children to the prison school. And every day she hoped that her husband's sentence would be reduced, that they would be released, that they could start a life outside the walls. That hope sustained her. It also trapped her, because leaving the prison meant abandoning her husband and losing the support network that kept her family housed and fed. The guards at La Mesa were, for the most part, poorly paid and poorly trained employees of the Baja California state government. A guard's salary in the late 1990s was approximately 3,000 to 4,000 pesos per month, roughly 300 to 400 US dollars. That salary was insufficient to support a family in Tijuana, where the cost of living was high due to the city's proximity to the US border. Guards supplemented their income through corruption. They facilitated the entry of contraband, drugs, weapons, cell phones, and building materials. They accepted bribes in exchange for housing assignments, for allowing conjugal visits, for looking the other way when violence occurred. Some guards were afraid to refuse. Cartel members inside the prison had connections outside. Guards who refused bribes or who attempted to enforce rules were threatened. Their families were threatened. Some were killed. The choice guards faced was not between corruption and integrity. It was between corruption and danger. Most chose corruption. Not all guards were complicit. Some tried to resist. Some reported the corruption to their supervisors. Some testified to human rights investigators. But these guards were transferred to other facilities, demoted or fired. The administration at La Mesa did not reward honesty. It rewarded compliance, because the administration itself was complicit. Prison directors and senior staff accepted payments from cartel members in exchange for maintaining the status quo. They allowed the construction of houses. They allowed families to move in. They allowed businesses to operate. In exchange, they received money and they avoided violence. The system worked for them. It did not work for the inmates without money, for the families living in overcrowded communal areas, or for the guards who wanted to do their jobs honestly. But those people had no power. The people with power, the cartel bosses, the corrupt administrators, the state government officials who turned a blind eye, benefited from the arrangement. The state government of Baja California, which operated La Mesa, was aware of the conditions. Governors knew, legislators knew, human rights commissions documented the situation in report after report. But intervention required resources that the state did not have and political will that it did not possess. Reforming La Mesa would require building new facilities, hiring more guards, increasing budgets, and confronting the cartels that controlled the prison. The political cost was high, the political benefit was low, and so, for decades, the state government did nothing. Governors came and went, administrators were replaced, reports were filed, and La Mesa continued to operate as a cartel-controlled city. The federal government, which had jurisdiction over organized crime and which had more resources than the state government, did not intervene until 2002. The reason was jurisdictional and political. Federal authorities could not enter a state prison without an invitation from the state government. And the state government, despite acknowledging the problems, did not invite federal intervention, because federal intervention meant admitting that the state had lost control. It meant political embarrassment. It meant federal authorities taking credit for solving a problem that the state should have solved itself. Mexican politics, like politics everywhere, is about perception and power. Admitting failure is politically costly. And so the state government delayed, negotiated, and resisted federal involvement as long as possible. When the federal government finally did intervene, it was not because the state asked for help. It was because President Vicente Fox made criminal justice reform a national priority, and because La Mesa had become an international embarrassment. In 2002, 1,500 federal police and soldiers stormed the prison. History cop. The raid was conducted without notifying state authorities in advance. It was a federal assertion of power, and it was violent. Inmates resisted, guards resisted, families were caught in the crossfire. When the raid ended, the cartel bosses had been transferred, the houses had been demolished, and the families had been expelled. But the people who had lived in El Pueblito, the inmates, the families, the guards, were not given anywhere to go. They were simply told the city was closed, and they were left to survive.
What was visible? What was documented? What was ignored for decades? The warnings were not subtle. They were public, documented, and repeated. Human rights organizations visited La Mesa and published reports detailing the conditions. Journalists filmed inside the prison and broadcast the footage internationally. Academic researchers studied La Mesa as a case study in institutional failure. Mexican government agencies, federal and state, conducted inspections and documented the overcrowding, the corruption, the presence of cartel leadership operating with impunity. The warnings were visible to anyone who cared to look. The problem was not lack of information. The problem was that the people with the power to intervene chose not to. Because intervention was expensive, dangerous, and politically risky. And as long as the violence stayed inside the walls, as long as inmates were not escaping, the government could justify inaction by claiming that the situation, while imperfect, was stable. The first major public documentation of conditions at La Mesa came in the mid-1990s when the Baja California State Human Rights Commission conducted an inspection of the facility. The Commission's report, published in 1996, documented severe overcrowding. The facility, designed to hold 600 inmates, was holding over 3,000. The report noted that inmates were living in makeshift structures built inside the prison, that families were residing inside the facility, and that commercial businesses, restaurants, bars, shops, were operating openly. The report recommended immediate action to reduce the population, to prohibit family residency, and to close the businesses. The recommendations were sent to the state government. No action was taken. In 1998, a journalist from the Los Angeles Times visited La Mesa and published a detailed account of what he saw. The article described the prison as a walled city where inmates live with their wives and children in houses they built themselves. The article quoted inmates who said they preferred La Mesa to freedom because the prison offered protection from rival cartels and from police extortion. The article included photographs of the restaurants, the housing, the families. The article was read by thousands of people in the United States and Mexico. It generated no political pressure for reform. Because the image it presented, a prison where inmates lived relatively normal lives with their families, did not provoke outrage. It provoked curiosity. For many readers, the story confirmed what they already believed about Mexico, that the government was weak, that corruption was endemic, and that the country operated according to rules that outsiders could not understand. In 2000, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture visited Mexico and inspected several prisons, including La Mesa. The rapporteur's report, published in 2001, documented that La Mesa was operating over 500% capacity, that inmates were living in conditions that violated international standards for humane treatment, and that the facility was effectively controlled by organized crime. The report noted that guards were afraid to enter certain areas of the prison without permission from inmate leaders. The report recommended that the Mexican government take immediate action to assert control over the facility and to reduce the population through transfers and through expedited trials for pre-trial detainees. The recommendations were non-binding. The Mexican government acknowledged the report. No action was taken. The most detailed documentation came from Mexican academics and human rights researchers who studied La Mesa as part of broader research into prison conditions in Mexico. One study, published in 2001 by researchers at the Colegio de la Frontera Norte, documented the economy inside La Mesa.
The researchers interviewed inmates, guards, and administrators. They documented the real estate transactions, the business operations, the cartel hierarchy. They estimated that the informal economy inside La Mesa generated millions of dollars annually, with profits going to cartel leaders, to corrupt guards, and to administrators. The study was published in an academic journal. It was cited by other researchers. It was used in university courses on criminology and Latin American studies. It was never cited by policymakers. Because academic research, no matter how rigorous, does not generate political pressure unless it is amplified by media or by organized advocacy. And in Mexico in the early 2000s, there were too many crises competing for attention. Drug violence was escalating across the country. Assassinations of journalists and politicians were routine. A prison where inmates lived in houses with their families was disturbing, but it was not the most urgent problem. The warning signs were also visible in the violence that periodically erupted inside La Mesa. In 1993, a riot between rival inmate factions left 11 dead and dozens injured. The riot was triggered by a dispute over control of the drug trade inside the prison. The federal government sent troops to restore order. The troops stayed for a week and then withdrew. The inmate hierarchy reasserted control. In 1998, another riot left 7 dead. Again, federal troops intervened. Again, they withdrew. The pattern was clear. Violence erupted when the cartel hierarchy was challenged or when external pressure disrupted the informal systems that maintained order. The federal government responded to crises but did not address the structural causes that produced El Pueblito. Troops would enter, restore order, and leave, and the conditions that had caused the violence would remain unchanged. Families of inmates also raised warnings. Letters sent to human rights organizations, to government officials, to journalists described the conditions inside La Mesa. Some letters praised the prison, saying that it allowed families to stay together, that it was safer than the streets of Tijuana. Other letters described overcrowding, violence, extortion by guards, and the presence of weapons. These letters were filed. Some were published in newspaper op-eds. Most were ignored, because the families had no political power. They were poor. Many were illiterate. They did not organize. They did not protest. They simply endured. Guards also raised warnings, though more quietly. In confidential interviews conducted by researchers, guards described the fear they felt working at La Mesa. They described being threatened by inmates, being offered bribes they could not refuse, being ordered by supervisors to ignore violations. Some guards reported these conditions to their supervisors. Some were told to stop complaining or they would be fired. Some were transferred to less dangerous posts. None of the guards who raised concerns were protected. None were rewarded. The message was clear. Complaining about corruption would end your career. Accepting corruption would allow you to keep your job. The most consequential warning came in 2001 when intelligence reports indicated that high-ranking members of the Tijuana cartel were using La Mesa as an operational base. The reports, compiled by federal law enforcement agencies, documented phone calls between inmates and cartel operatives outside the prison. The calls included orders for drug shipments, for assassinations, for kidnappings. The intelligence was shared with state authorities in Baja California. The state government acknowledged the reports, but did not request federal assistance. The reason, articulated privately by state officials, was that a federal raid would be violent, would generate negative media coverage, and would make the state government look incompetent. Better to manage the situation internally. Better to avoid confrontation. Better to wait. The waiting ended on September 17, 2002, when the federal government stopped asking for permission and simply acted. 1,500 federal police and soldiers stormed the prison in a surprise nighttime raid. The raid was justified by citing the intelligence reports, the human rights violations, and the need to reassert state authority. But the raid was also political. President Fox needed visible victories in his campaign against organized crime. La Mesa was a visible failure.
Raiding it, dismantling the cartel infrastructure, and transferring the leadership to federal maximum security prisons was a visible success. The fact that the raid did not solve the underlying problems, the overcrowding, the underfunding, the corruption, was less important than the fact that it looked like the government was taking action. The warning signs had been visible for decades. The reports had been written, the recommendations had been made, the violence had been documented, and all of it had been ignored, until the political cost of inaction exceeded the political cost of intervention. The raid was not a response to new information. It was a response to old information that had finally become politically impossible to ignore. The system knew what was happening at La Mesa. The system had chosen to allow it. And when the system finally chose to intervene, it did so with overwhelming force, without a plan for what would come next, and without addressing any of the structural causes that had produced El Pueblito.
When the raid happened, September 17, 2002, when the little town was destroyed in a single night. September 17, 2002, 3 a.m. The gates of La Mesa were breached by 1,500 federal police and soldiers. The raid was not announced. Inmates were asleep in their houses. Families were inside. Children were sleeping. The operation was swift, militarized, and violent. By dawn, the city that had existed inside the prison for decades was gone. The cartel bosses had been transferred to federal maximum security facilities. Over 900 houses and businesses had been demolished, and the families who had lived inside La Mesa for years were expelled, told to leave, given no assistance, no compensation, no explanation beyond the fact that the government had decided the little town was over. The operation began with a perimeter lockdown. Federal forces surrounded the facility at approximately 2:30 a.m. Helicopters circled overhead. Military personnel took positions on rooftops of buildings adjacent to the prison. The main gate and all secondary access points were sealed. Communications were jammed. Cell phone signals inside the prison were blocked to prevent inmates from coordinating resistance. At 3 a.m., the federal forces entered. Tactical units using battering rams breached the main gate and several points along the perimeter wall. Tear gas was deployed in multiple areas to disorient inmates and to force them out of their houses and into open areas where they could be controlled. The resistance was immediate. Inmates fired weapons. Some had handguns. Some had rifles. The firefight lasted approximately 30 minutes. Federal forces returned fire. Helicopters provided aerial support. The sound of gunfire echoed across the surrounding neighborhood, waking residents who called local media to report what sounded like a military assault. By 3:45 a.m., the federal forces had secured the main courtyard and the administrative buildings. Inmates who had resisted were subdued. Some were injured. Some were killed. The official casualty count from the raid was never publicly released. Human rights organizations later estimated that at least 3 inmates were killed and dozens were injured. Federal forces reported several injured officers, but no deaths. Once the facility was secured, the next phase began, the identification and transfer of high-value targets. Intelligence teams entered the prison with lists of inmates to be transferred to federal custody. These were cartel leaders, high-ranking traffickers, individuals who posed the greatest security risk. The teams moved through the residential areas, breaking down doors, searching houses, detaining specific individuals. Ismael Higuera Guerrero, El Mayel, was one of the first to be taken. He was found in his multi-story house, which federal agents described as being furnished with a full kitchen, satellite television, air conditioning, and personal belongings that would not have been out of place in a middle-class home. Higuera was placed in restraints and transferred to a helicopter.
Within hours, he was in a federal maximum security prison in central Mexico, far from the border, far from his organization's power base. Approximately 50 inmates were transferred during the raid. These were the most powerful individuals at La Mesa, the individuals who had controlled the economy, who had maintained order, who had protected their followers and punished their enemies. Their removal created an immediate power vacuum. The inmates who remained had no leadership. The guards, who had been complicit in the old system, had no clear instructions for the new one. And the federal forces, who had conducted the raid, were not staying. They were there to dismantle the cartel infrastructure, not to operate the prison. By dawn, the federal forces had accomplished their mission. The cartel bosses were gone, and the bulldozers arrived. Over 900 makeshift houses and businesses were demolished. History cop, the demolition was systematic and uncompromising. Bulldozers entered the prison and began tearing down every structure that had been built by inmates. Houses where families had lived for years were reduced to rubble. Restaurants that had served thousands of meals were destroyed. Bars, shops, schools, clinics, all of it was demolished. The families living inside La Mesa were given hours to gather their belongings and leave. They were not offered housing assistance. They were not compensated for the homes they had built or purchased. They were simply told the prison was being returned to its original design and that civilians were no longer permitted inside. One woman whose husband was serving a sentence at La Mesa and who had lived inside the prison with her 3 children for 5 years described the morning of the raid in testimony given to human rights investigators. She said that she woke to the sound of gunfire. She gathered her children and hid in their small house, not knowing what was happening. Federal soldiers broke down the door and ordered them out. They were taken to the main courtyard and told to wait. Hours passed. Her children cried. Other families stood around her, some with infants, some with elderly relatives, all of them confused and afraid. Eventually, they were told to leave. She asked where she should go. She was told that was not the government's problem. She left with her children, carrying what belongings she could fit into 2 bags. She had no money. She had no family outside the prison willing to take her in. She spent the first night sleeping in a shelter run by a Catholic charity. She spent the next 3 months trying to find work and housing. She never saw her husband again. He was transferred to another facility. She could not afford the transportation to visit him. The demolition took several days. By the time it was complete, the interior of La Mesa looked like a disaster zone. Rubble was piled everywhere. The streets that had been paved by inmates were torn up. The infrastructure, the electrical wiring, the water lines was destroyed. The prison was returned to its bare concrete foundation. The cell blocks, which had been largely abandoned during the years when inmates lived in houses, were now the only residential space available, and the population that had been over 7,000 before the raid was now crammed into those cells. Because the federal forces had transferred only 50 inmates, the remaining 7,000 were still there, and they had nowhere to live. The overcrowding that had been tolerable when inmates had houses became unbearable when they were forced into cells. Sometimes 24 inmates were housed in a 10-foot by 13-foot cell. Inmates slept in shifts because there was not enough floor space for everyone to lie down simultaneously. Toilets were shared by dozens of men. Showers were shared by hundreds. The food, which had been supplemented by the prison economy when restaurants operated, was now provided solely by the state, and the state budget for food was insufficient. Inmates went hungry. Violence increased. Inmates who had previously coexisted under the cartel hierarchy now fought for resources, for space, for survival.
The guards, who had been complicit in the old system, now were tasked with enforcing a new system they had not been trained for. The federal government did not send additional staff. The state government did not increase the budget. The guards who remained were the same guards who accepted bribes, who had facilitated contraband, who had allowed the city to exist. Now they were expected to maintain order without the cartel hierarchy that had done that work for them. They were afraid. Some guards quit. Some requested transfers. Some stayed because they had no other options. And the prison, which had been stable for decades under informal inmate governance, became unstable under formal state control. The families who had been expelled had nowhere to go. Most were poor. Most had moved into the prison because they could not afford housing outside. Now they were on the streets. Some found temporary shelter with relatives. Some moved into homeless encampments. Some women turned to sex work because they had no other way to support their children. The children who had grown up inside La Mesa, who had attended school there, who had known no other home, were now traumatized and displaced. Human rights organizations attempted to provide assistance, but the scale of the need overwhelmed their capacity. The state government provided no assistance. The federal government, which had conducted the raid, considered its mission complete. The cartel infrastructure had been dismantled. The prison was returned to state control. What happened to the families was not the federal government's responsibility. The first incident was not the raid itself. The first incident was the realization in the days and weeks that followed that dismantling a system is not the same as replacing it. The federal government had destroyed El Pueblito, but it had not built anything in its place. The overcrowding remained, the underfunding remained, the corruption remained.
Why it didn't stop after the raid. Why 2008 became the bloodiest year in La Mesa's history. The raid was supposed to solve the problem. It did not. What it did was remove the informal power structure that had maintained stability, however brutal that stability had been, and replace it with formal state control that lacked the resources, the staffing, and the legitimacy to maintain order. The years following the 2002 raid were marked by increasing violence, by failed attempts at reform, and by a growing realization that the federal government had dismantled a system without understanding what that system had been doing. The cartel bosses had been transferred, the houses had been demolished, but the inmates who remained were still there, still overcrowded, still underfed, and now without the patronage networks and employment opportunities that had kept the prison relatively stable. The violence that followed was not random, it was structural. It was the predictable result of removing order without replacing it. In the months after the raid, the inmate population at La Mesa remained above 7,000. The federal government had transferred only 50 high-value targets. The state government did not have the capacity to transfer additional inmates to other facilities. There was nowhere to send them. Every other prison in Baja California was also overcrowded. The plan, such as it was to reduce the population gradually through expedited trials and through transfers to federal custody for inmates convicted of federal crimes. But the courts were backlogged, trials were delayed, and the population did not decrease. What did decrease was the quality of life for the inmates who remained. Before the raid, inmates with money had been able to purchase or rent housing, to buy better food, to pay for protection. After the raid, those options were gone. The restaurants and stores had been demolished. The real estate market had been destroyed. Inmates were crammed into cells designed for far fewer people. The food provided by the state was insufficient in quantity and poor in quality. Medical care, which had never been adequate, became almost non-existent. The prison clinic was overwhelmed. Inmates with chronic illnesses went untreated. Inmates with tuberculosis, HIV, and other communicable diseases were housed alongside healthy inmates with no isolation protocols. The conditions were not just uncomfortable, they were dangerous. Violence escalated.
Fights over sleeping space, over food, over perceived slights became routine. Inmates formed new alliances based on geography. Inmates from the same neighborhoods in Tijuana banded together for protection. These alliances sometimes corresponded to cartel affiliations. The Tijuana cartel was weaker after the raid, but it was not gone. The Sinaloa cartel, which had been competing with the Tijuana cartel for control of drug trafficking routes, began asserting influence inside La Mesa. Inmates affiliated with Sinaloa fought with inmates affiliated with Tijuana. The prison became a proxy battleground for the cartel war happening outside the walls. Guards who had been complicit in the old system were now expected to prevent violence they had no training or resources to stop. The state government did not increase staffing at La Mesa after the raid. The guards who had worked there before continued to work thereafter, but the dynamics had changed. Before the raid, guards had maintained order by deferring to the cartel hierarchy. After the raid, there was no hierarchy to defer to. Guards were outnumbered, underpaid, and afraid. Some guards attempted to enforce rules. They confiscated contraband, they broke up fights, they conducted searches, and they were threatened, assaulted, or killed. In 2004, a guard at La Mesa was stabbed to death by an inmate during a routine cell inspection. The state government condemned the killing. No reforms were implemented. Contraband continued to flow into the prison. Drugs, weapons, and cell phones entered through the same channels that had existed before the raid. Guards facilitated the smuggling in exchange for bribes. The amounts had increased because the risks had increased, but the corruption persisted. Inmates with money could still buy drugs, could still communicate with associates outside, could still obtain weapons. The raid had not eliminated the black market, it had simply made it more expensive and more dangerous. In 2006, the Baja California state government announced a reform plan for La Mesa. The plan included constructing a new cell block to reduce overcrowding, hiring additional guards, increasing the food budget, and implementing educational and vocational programs for inmates. The plan was ambitious. It was also underfunded. The legislature approved a fraction of the requested budget. The new cell block was never built. The additional guards were never hired. The programs were never implemented. The plan existed on paper. In practice, nothing changed. The violence reached a critical point in 2008. On September 17, 2008, 6 years to the day after the federal raid, a riot erupted inside La Mesa. The day-long riot left 19 inmates dead and nearly 60 wounded. ABC 13, Houston. The riot began as a fight between inmates affiliated with the Tijuana cartel and inmates affiliated with Sinaloa. The fight escalated. Weapons appeared. Knives, clubs, firearms. Guards attempted to intervene. They were overwhelmed. The riot spread through multiple cell blocks. Inmates set fires. They destroyed property. They took hostages. The state government called for assistance. Federal police and military personnel were deployed. Prisoners report being chased down prison hallways by police shooting at them from behind, and federal military police firing live ammunition at prisoners from helicopters. State of Michigan. The use of live ammunition from helicopters was later confirmed by human rights investigators who documented bullet holes in the prison's interior walls and courtyard. The response was not designed to de-escalate, it was designed to suppress. By nightfall, the riot was over. 19 inmates were dead. Dozens were injured. The bodies were removed, the injured were treated at the prison clinic or transferred to hospitals, and the underlying conditions that had caused the riot remained unchanged. The 2008 riot generated national and international media coverage. Human rights organizations condemned the use of live ammunition. They called for investigations. They called for prosecutions. The state government ordered an internal review. The review concluded that the guards and federal forces had acted appropriate given the danger they faced. No one was charged, no one was fired. The state government announced again that reforms were needed. Again, no reforms were implemented. The escalation continued because the system had not changed. The overcrowding persisted, the underfunding persisted, the corruption persisted, and the federal government, which had intervened in 2002 and again in 2008, had no long-term plan for La Mesa. Federal forces entered, suppressed violence, and left. The state government, which operated the prison, lacked the resources to prevent future violence. The cycle repeated. Violence erupted, federal forces intervened, violence was suppressed, and the conditions that produced the violence remained. The escalation was not a failure of enforcement, it was a failure of policy. The raid in 2002 had dismantled the system, but the government had never built a replacement, and in the absence of a functional system, violence filled the vacuum.
How it broke, what it cost, what it means. The exposure of La Mesa did not produce the consequences it should have. The 2002 raid documented that a state prison had been controlled by cartels for decades. The 2008 riot documented that the state government lacked the capacity to maintain order. Human rights organizations published reports detailing the overcrowding, the violence, the use of excessive force. International media covered the story. The conditions at La Mesa were not secret. They were public, documented, and widely known, and almost none of it resulted in systemic reform. Because the problems at La Mesa were not unique to La Mesa. They were problems that existed across the Mexican prison system. And solving those problems would require resources, political will, and institutional capacity that the Mexican government at federal and state levels did not have or was unwilling to deploy. Byron Garcia, the warden who had overseen La Mesa during some of the years when El Pueblito existed, was never charged with corruption or abuse. He was not even fired. He retired from the prison service and moved on to other employment. The guards who had facilitated the construction of the city, who had accepted bribes, who had allowed cartel bosses to operate with impunity, were never held accountable. Some remained employed at La Mesa, some transferred to other facilities. The system protected them because holding them accountable would have required admitting that the administration had known what was happening and had allowed it. That admission would have exposed state officials to legal liability, so the admission was never made. The families who were expelled from La Mesa in 2002 received no compensation, no housing assistance, no support. Some found shelter with relatives, some became homeless, some women turned to sex work to support their children. The children who had grown up inside the prison, who had known no other home, were traumatized by the sudden displacement. Human rights organizations attempted to track these families and provide assistance, but the scale of the displacement overwhelmed their capacity. Most of the families disappeared into the informal economy of Tijuana, surviving however they could, forgotten by the state that had expelled them. The inmates who remained at La Mesa after the raid continued to live in overcrowded, dangerous, and inhumane conditions. The population gradually decreased over the years as inmates were transferred, released, or died. By 2016, the population had dropped to approximately 4,000, still more than double the design capacity, still overcrowded, still violent. In 2016, the Baja California state government announced that La Mesa would be closed and that inmates would be transferred to a new facility. The closure was announced. The timeline was vague. As of 2024, La Mesa remains open. The new facility was never built. The inmates were never transferred. The crisis continues. The federal government, which had conducted the 2002 raid, considered the operation a success. The cartel leadership had been removed. The illegal infrastructure had been demolished. The message had been sent.
that the government would not tolerate prisons being used as operational basis for organized crime. The fact that the conditions after the raid were worse than before, the fact that the 2008 riot was bloodier than any violence that had occurred under cartel control, was less important than the symbolic victory. The government had acted. The government had reasserted control. That was the narrative. That was what mattered. The 2008 riot generated temporary scrutiny. Human rights organizations documented that federal forces had used excessive force, that inmates had been shot from helicopters, that the response had been designed to punish rather than to de-escalate. The organizations called for investigations. The Baja California state government and the federal government both claimed that investigations were conducted. The findings were never made public. No one was prosecuted. The use of force was justified as necessary given the danger posed by armed inmates. The cycle continued. Violence erupted. The state responded with overwhelming force. The violence was suppressed, and the structural conditions that produced the violence remained. The inmates at La Mesa, the consequences are permanent. Thousands of men spent years of their lives in conditions that violated every standard of human dignity. Some were guilty of the crimes they were accused of. Many were not. Some were awaiting trial and were never convicted. The Mexican criminal justice system moves slowly. Pre-trial detention can last years. Inmates at La Mesa lived in those conditions, overcrowded, violent, degrading, while waiting for trials that were repeatedly delayed. Some inmates died before their cases were resolved. Some were killed in riots. Some died from disease. The death toll at La Mesa over the decades is unknown. Official records are incomplete. Many deaths were not properly documented. The consequences for Mexican society are also permanent. La Mesa became a symbol of state failure. A prison that was allowed to become a cartel-controlled city, then violently dismantled, then left to descend to chaos, is not an example of law and order. It is an example of abandonment. The Mexican government abandoned the inmates, it abandoned the guards, it abandoned the families, and when the government finally intervened, it did so with force that produced more suffering than it alleviated. The lesson that Mexican citizens learned from La Mesa is that the state cannot be trusted to manage its prisons, cannot be trusted to protect the people it incarcerates, and cannot be trusted to reform systems that are visibly, obviously broken. The international consequences are minimal. La Mesa was covered in documentaries, in news articles, in academic papers. The coverage was sensational. A prison where inmates lived in houses with their families, where cartel bosses ran their organizations behind bars, where the government lost control for decades. The coverage generated attention, but not pressure, because La Mesa was in Mexico, because the victims were Mexican inmates, because the international community, particularly the United States, had no leverage and no incentive to demand reform. The U.S. government was focused on stopping drugs from crossing the border. How Mexico managed its prisons was Mexico's problem. As long as the cartels were disrupted, as long as the drug flow was interrupted, the conditions inside Mexican prisons were not a U.S. priority. The ending is not satisfying. La Mesa still operates. The overcrowding persists. The violence continues. The guards are still underpaid. The inmates still live in conditions that violate international standards. The 2002 raid dismantled the city. The 2008 riot killed 19 people, and nothing fundamentally changed. Because the problems at La Mesa are not problems that can be solved with raids or with force. They are problems that require resources, political will, and institutional reform, and those things in Mexico in 2024 remain in short supply. The city within the prison is gone. The houses are demolished, the families are expelled, the cartel bosses are transferred, but the crisis that produced the city remains, and in the absence of solutions, the violence continues, the suffering continues, the state continues to fail, and the inmates at La Mesa continue to survive, however they can, in a system that has forgotten them.